Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This evening we are going to continue and conclude our discussion of the common fallacies, and that will enable us next week to begin the topic of deduction. We have a dozen more of these common fallacies to do this evening. Some are quite simple on the basis of what we've said so far, and we can cover them comparatively briefly. A few are more complex. And in one or two cases, I'll just mention the fallacy in a sentence or two so you'll have a complete list, but no further discussion will be required. And then I want to take up the exercises assigned from last week. Let us begin then with the first one this evening, a very important, very commonly committed fallacy, equivocation. E-Q-U-I, and then vocation, V-O-C-A-T-I-O-N, equivocation. Equivocation is a fallacy that is made possible by ambiguity. So let's begin by defining what is ambiguity. A unit of discourse, by which we mean a word, a phrase, possibly a whole sentence. A unit of discourse is said to be ambiguous if it is capable of having two or more different meanings. If its meaning is not clear, it is capable of having two or more different meanings. It is said to be ambiguous. Now you will know as a common fact of the English language, and of course others, that an individual word by itself, if you utter it without any context, can have a variety of very different meanings. Take, for instance, the word trunk, T-R-U-N-K. By itself, uttered in no context, it can mean the sort of thing you take to Grand Central Station, the sort of thing that comes off an elephant's face, and a whole variety of other possibilities. So if I simply uttered trunk to you, that would be regarded as an ambiguous word simply by itself without context. And this is an enormously common phenomenon. All puns are based on such linguistic ambiguity. Somebody puts forth an argument and I say to him, your argument is sound. Nothing but sound. I'm obviously then switching, you get it, from valid to noise, both of which can be meant by the word sound. Now, equivocation is a fallacy which arises from playing on ambiguity. Whenever the meaning of some term, which could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be even part of a word, that's what we mean by a term here. Whenever the meaning of some term is switched within the course of an argument, so that the same term is used in two different senses in the argument, and it is that switch which makes the conclusion possible, then obviously the conclusion does not in fact follow. And such a fallacy is called equivocation. It's the fallacy of purporting to justify a conclusion on the basis of premises which contain terms used in two different senses, and consequently resting your conclusion on simply a linguistic switch. Now, the theory of this is very simple. The trick is to become skilled at perceiving it in examples, some of which are obvious and some of which can be extraordinarily subtle. Take this one down as a simple, clear-cut example of the pattern of equivocation. Premise one, take this down so you can actually look at it. Where there are laws, there must be a lawgiver. Obviously true in one sense. Premise two, there are laws of nature. Conclusion, there must be a lawgiver to nature. And guess who? Now, where is the equivocation here? On what obvious term? On the term law, right? In the first statement, where there are laws, there must be a lawgiver. That is true of one specific usage of the term law. If, for instance, you are thinking of a political law, statute law, or more broadly what's called a prescriptive law, where some group of human beings declares this is the kind of conduct you must engage in, and if not, there will be such and such penalty. Now, in that use of the term law, obviously there can be no law if there is not somebody who defines the appropriate code of conduct and enjoins the penalty. In that usage, where there are laws, there must be a lawgiver. When you come now to the statement, there are laws of nature, what sense of the term law is being employed in that statement? Obviously there, it's not an issue of a prescription enjoined by a legislature which presupposes the legislator. There you mean by law, approximately, a uniform mode of behavior in the physical world. You mean a certain type of causal relation which holds universally within a certain type of acting entity. So to put it very simply, you mean not a prescription as to how people should behave under the threat of certain penalties, but a description of how natural objects, as a matter of fact, do behave. Now, in conjunction with law in this second sense, there is obviously no plausibility to the idea that a law requires a lawgiver. It's not as though there is a heavenly Congress made of various political parties and they get together and pass the law of gravity and issue the injunction to material particles, either you attract each other at such and such a rate or you go to hell. Obviously that doesn't take place, and there's no question of a lawgiver in such a case. And therefore, obviously, the conclusion does not follow. Now, this is typical of all equivocations. The premises are individually plausible, but the conclusion does not follow because the premises involve a switch in the meaning of the term from one meaning to another. Take this down as another example. It's a brief and eloquent example of equivocation. Voting is right. That's premise one. The state should enforce rights. Premise two. Now you can guess what's coming. Therefore, the state should enforce voting. Voting is right. The state should enforce rights. Therefore, the state should enforce voting. Now, on what term in this example is there an obvious equivocation? The using of the term in two different senses. Obviously, the term right. In the first sentence, when you say voting is right, you are using right as an approximate synonym for correct, good, proper, moral. In the second statement, when you say the state should enforce rights, the meaning of right there is not the state should force you to do whatever is moral, good, or proper. The meaning of right there is a specific individual prerogative which you have the freedom to choose to exercise or not, and which it's the function of the state to protect. Consequently, when the conclusion of this argument declares the state should enforce voting, should force you to vote, it's resting on a blatant equivocation. There would be no equivocation if the argument were as follows. Voting is moral. The state should force you to do whatever is moral. Therefore, the state should force you to vote. That would be a bad argument, but it would not have an equivocation. And there the premise would leap out at you immediately. The premise that the state should force you to do whatever is moral, and you would immediately object. But the technique of equivocation, you see, is to switch on the word so you don't object to either premise separately, because you hear right in the first sentence as one meaning, and right in the second sentence as a different meaning. Suppose we eliminate that particular equivocation, and you'll see that another one could pop up in the same argument. Suppose I gave you this variant. Voting is a right. And I mean by right there a specific prerogative which it's up to the state to protect. Voting is a right. Premise 2, the state should enforce rights. Conclusion, the state should enforce voting. Well, now I have eliminated the first equivocation. Would you agree with the argument as I presented? Well, you'd immediately say to me in such a case, your conclusion is ambiguous. It's susceptible of two different interpretations. When you say the state should enforce voting, do you mean the state should protect you in your exercise of your right to vote? If so, there's no equivocation and the argument is perfectly valid. Voting is a right. The state should protect you in your exercise of rights. Therefore, the state should protect you in your exercise of voting. Or you would say, do you mean by your conclusion the state should enforce voting? The state should compel you to vote whether you want to or not. If you mean that, then you have engaged in an equivocation, and in this case the equivocation would be on the term enforce, which in the premise means protect you in your exercise of, and in the conclusion mean compel you to exercise whether you want to or not. In other words, these are classic examples of equivocation, simple, obvious ones, to just keep in mind before you when you encounter a little more subtle one. Let me give you one more. I won't take the time to dictate it because it's long, but I think you can grasp this simply from hearing it. The management of an industry has the sole responsibility for keeping its plant and means of production in repair. So you say true. Next premise. The health of the workers is an indispensable means of production. Say, well, okay. Conclusion. The management has the sole responsibility for preserving the health of the workers. And then the person goes on, there should be business-financed health plans and all the rest of it. Now, what is the phrase in this case which is being used equivocally in two different meanings? The phrase means of production. In the first case, when you say the management of an industry has sole responsibility for keeping its means of production in repair, you mean by means of production, it's actual physical tools, the physical equipment, the machinery. And there, of course, the premise is correct. When you say the health of the workers is an indispensable means of production, obviously the health of the workers is not part of the physical equipment. And therefore, the person in that premise is using means of production in a much broader and looser sense, as approximately equivalent to any factor which is required for the factory to be able to run successfully. Well, in that sense of the term, there is a host of factors required for the factory to be able to run successfully, which not by the wildest stretch of the imagination could you say the management has the sole responsibility for maintaining. For instance, a sound currency, a stable government, a decent philosophy, just to mention a few. And therefore, this argument rests blatantly on an equivocation. Let me give you one more. This one I won't solve for you today. I'll simply tell you that it's a fallacy of equivocation. And for homework for next week, when you'll be getting other examples in the sheets, take this one down because I left it off and see if you can figure out where the equivocation is. This is a tricky one in the nature of a parlor game, but it's a good example of equivocation. The first premise. What happens every day is a usual event. Second premise. Unusual events happen every day. Conclusion. Unusual events are usual events. Now there is a blatant contradiction, so you know that something is wrong. And in this case, it is a gross equivocation, but I'll leave it to you to decide for next week on what term, word or phrase, does this equivocation rest. And when you say that it is an equivocation, you have to be able to state what are the two different senses that the person is using. All right, let's leave equivocation and go on to the next fallacy. This is also a fallacy of ambiguity, but it is a different kind of ambiguity from equivocation. And this one has the name amphiboly. A-M-P-H-I-B-O-L-Y. Amphiboly. Now, in the fallacy of equivocation, The ambiguity strikes a particular word or phrase, which is used in two different senses. In amphiboly, each individual term is perfectly clear. There's no question of switching the meaning of a particular term. There's no equivocation. But the ambiguity arises from the way the words are put together in the sentence. So if you want a technical definition, amphiboly is ambiguity arising from the grammatical construction of a sentence, from the way the words are put together. It is ambiguity arising from the grammatical construction of a sentence, or it might be of a whole paragraph. Now take this simple example. You see a notice and it says, employees only may use the service elevators. Now what does that mean? Each word is clear. There's no equivocation. You know what employees mean, and only, and use, and elevators, etc. But the sentence as a whole is capable of two entirely different meanings, depending upon where you connect the only. Does it mean only employees may use the service elevators, but no other people can? The service elevators are restricted to employees. Or does it mean employees may use only the service elevators, they can't use the regular ones? Now, there's no way to tell from the construction of the sentence as it's written. The only could be taken with employees or with using the service elevators that's put right in the middle. Now, this is actually a grammatical violation because you'd have to say either only employees or employees may use only. There's a simple example of the adjective form of it. It's an amphibulous utterance. Here's one where the absence of punctuation makes the statement amphibulous. Woman, I'll say the sentence simply without any punctuation as well as I can. Woman without her man would be lost. Now, if I ask you, do you agree with that sentence or not? That sentence is capable of two entirely different meanings, depending upon where you put the commas. Suppose you say, woman, comma, without her man, comma, would be lost. That gives you one view of the relation of woman to man. But suppose you take the exact same structure of words and say, woman, comma, without her, comma, man would be lost. Completely different meaning, and yet the exact same set of words. There it's amphibulous, owing to the lack of punctuation. Now, I've collected a variety of these. Here are a few that I don't think require elaborate discussion. This was from a review, and it said, quote, the author warns against a number of logical errors in his book. You get the amphiboly there. Does he warn in his book or does he commit them in his book? Here was apparently an actual want ad, according to one book. Antique desk suitable for lady with curved legs and large drawers. Also mahogany chest. From a cookbook. Serve the meat when thoroughly stewed. From a newspaper account about the departure of the Graf Zeppelin. Quote, the Graf Zeppelin was leaving the Lakehurst Airport. Among the last to enter was Mrs. Smith, lone woman passenger. Slowly her huge nose was turned into the wind. Then, like some huge beast, she crawled along the grass. Obvious amphibulous construction there, running from one sentence to the other. There was a song many years ago that made the bestseller charts, I think, simply by virtue of an amphiboly in its opening line, which was "Throw Mama from the Train." I don't know if you remember that. And people got a kick out of that. And the next line began, "A kiss." You see, throw her a kiss from the train, but people got their kicks out of the amphiboly in the opening line. Now, the most important use in connection with this course of amphiboly that I want to call your attention to is that there is a certain structure which is amphibolious in English, and which I will want to warn you against when we get to the analysis of deductive reasoning. And that is any proposition of the form, all S is not P. All S is not P, where S stands for any group of things you're talking about, and P stands for any characteristic at all. Whenever you have a statement of the form, all something is not something, that is an amphibolious utterance susceptible of two different interpretations. For instance, suppose I give you the statement, all that glitters is not gold. Now, in such a case, what is the meaning of this statement? Is it nothing that glitters is gold? Obviously not. It means some things that glitter are not gold, and some are. In that case, the all really means all isn't, but some are. On the other hand, suppose you ask me how many men are not immortal, and I say all men are not immortal. In that case, the same structure, all S is not P, means no men are immortal. Now, in those two cases, the context in your other information lets you know whether to interpret it as an unrestricted, universal denial or simply a partial denial. Some is and some isn't. But in many cases, you simply can't tell, and the statement is hopeless to deal with. For instance, suppose I make the statement, all the invited guests are not going to the party. Well, which do I mean? All of them aren't, only some are, or all of them aren't. None are, you see. There's no way to tell. It's an amphibolious utterance. And we have special rules for how to deal with such when we get to the discussion of deduction. But for now, I simply call your attention to the fact that this form, all S is not P, is a banned form because it's amphibolious. And if ever you encounter it in reasoning, you have to judge by appropriate rules which is the actual meaning and rewrite it accordingly. Amphiboly, I may say in conclusion, is a very common fallacy, particularly among writers. It requires a whole process of training yourself to see that you have actually said what you mean objectively in cold print or handwriting, rather than simply that, well, you know what you mean in your mind, but it didn't really get out there on paper. It's a very common error in writing. All right, let's look next at accent. Accent. Now, accent is a fallacy of improper emphasis. It occurs when one distorts the meaning of some unit of discourse by improperly, misleadingly emphasizing or accenting some element of it. To repeat that. Accent is the fallacy that occurs when you distort the meaning of some unit of discourse, some statement, some paragraph, whatever. You distort it by improperly or misleadingly emphasizing or accenting some element of it. Now, the background of this fallacy is that statements, utterances, can have different meanings depending upon the words or phrases that are emphasized or accented. And if you emphasize or accent a statement in such a way as to distort its original meaning, even if the literal words that you report are correct, you commit the fallacy of accent. Now, a simple example. A man makes a statement. Let us assume his original statement is completely unaccented, and I'll try to deliver it in as unaccented a way. He simply says, I hope you will come to dinner. And I report to somebody, he said, I hope you will come to dinner. Now, by the stress on the word I, by the accent I gave it, the obvious implication is that something like this is the man has said, his wife doesn't want me to come to dinner, or his brother-in-law doesn't want me to come to dinner, but I hope you will. Suppose he said, I hope you will come to dinner. That's how I report his statement. And the implication is, don't bring your wife. Or, I hope you will come to dinner, with the implication and don't stay all night, you see. The crudest example I ever encountered of such a distorted accenting is somebody who argued that the Christian ethics absolutely justifies a person in lying about other human beings. And when he was confronted with the obviously relevant parts of the scripture, he said, well, it simply says, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And the person I was lying about is blocks away. Now that is a crude example of accent. Now accent can take place in visual besides oral forms. For instance, there are tabloids that'll have a front page which has two words on it. One in huge letters occupying 7/8 of the page, the word war. And then in little tiny letters underneath it, just, almost submicroscopic, the word unlikely. Now that is a visual accent where they're counting upon the huge disparity in type sizes to sell papers by conveying a misleading meaning. And of course you could point to any number of want ads and other such things as examples. You see them sometimes in the papers in respectably sized type, new apartment building, Midtown Manhattan, single, double apartments, $50. And that's in big type, and then in little tiny submicroscopic type, and up. And of course that is visual accent, and you find in most cases that they had one apartment for $50. This is a closet in the basement that's been rented in perpetuity. Now another form of accent is given its own name, but you can consider it simply a subdivision of accent. It is called excerpt lifting. Excerpt lifting. In this case, you quote words of some previous speaker or writer, but you omit part of what he said. You excerpt out certain sections. And of course, in the normal scholarly convention in such cases, you put in the ellipsis sign, 3 dots, to stand for the parts you've left out. Now, this is perfectly all right to do. There's nothing to say you have to quote everything a man said. But if you excerpt judiciously and put your 3 dots in the right places, or rather the wrong places, you can get a speaker or writer to say just about anything. And in this case, you commit accent by excerpt lifting completely unrepresentative excerpts, which is very common in polemics, where you distort an opponent's position by citing a statement riddled with 3 dots in unfair places. I've seen people, I must say not often, but for instance say, even the Bible advocates atheism because it says, quote, 3 dots, there is no God, close quote. Now, you know where that comes from. It says, the Bible says, quote, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Only they leave that little part out, you see. That's accent via excerpt lifting. Now, the field day for this version of accent is the use that is made of reviews for books, for plays, for movies, and so on, where they take very often fantastically unrepresentative excerpts and paste them over the marquees. Now here, for instance, I'll just make up an example, but this is not unusual. The original statement, let us say, that appeared in the press was something like this. This play has no impact whatever. It is a fantastic waste of time and money. I felt a sense of exaltation when this monstrosity was finally over and the curtain came down. And then you see blazoned across the marquee or the ad in the paper, critic such and such says, quote, 3 dots. Impact, 3 dots. Fantastic, 3 dots. I felt a sense of exaltation, 3 dots. Now you see, that completely changes the meaning of the original statement by excerpt lifting. Now, as a general rule, it's a good thing to be suspicious of 3 dots, particularly if they frequently interrupt the text. Now, it's all right if they don't involve misleading accenting, but the general convention among people is that it's better to quote too much if you're citing some source, simply to assure your readers you're not excerpt lifting. Well, to summarize then, accent is the fallacy of improper emphasis, whether tonally, visually, by selection of words or points, and thereby distorting the original meaning. All right, now let's take a trickier, more insidious fallacy. Composition. Now, the definition of this is a real mouthful, so I won't begin by giving it to you because you will be battered into insensibility by the length of this definition. I'll first make the central idea, which is very easy. I'll present it to you in straightforward terms and then give you the formal definition. In composition, you reason from parts to a whole, or from individuals to a group. Think as simple examples of a machine as being a whole, made of a whole variety of parts, or a football team as being a group made of a whole number of individuals. Now, in this fallacy, composition, the essence of the error is that you find some characteristic which is true of each part as a part, or each individual as an individual, and you conclude that it must therefore be true of the whole as a whole, or the group as a group. You start with some information about each part of a whole, for instance, a machine, and you automatically assume it's true of the machine as a whole. You start with some information about each member of the football team, and you conclude it's automatically, necessarily true of the team as a whole. That is a fallacy. That is called composition. Now, if you got the general idea, let me give you this mouthful of a definition and then give you some examples. Composition, the inference in which you pass fallaciously from the fact that a certain characteristic is true of each part of a whole, or each member of a group, taken separately, comma, to the conclusion that that characteristic is true of the whole as a whole, or the group as a group. I'll repeat that one. The composition, the inference in which you pass fallaciously from the fact that a certain characteristic is true of each part of a whole, or each member of a group taken separately, to the conclusion that that characteristic is true of the whole as a whole, or the group as a group. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is always fallacious. For instance, take the machine case. If each part is made of gold, every screw and nut and bolt and gadget within it is made of gold, then it's perfectly valid to say the machine as a whole is made of gold. Or if each member of the football team wants a 2-month vacation, it's perfectly valid to say the team, meaning the team as a whole, wants a vacation. But the point of this fallacy is that there are a great many cases in which that sort of inference from parts to a whole, or from individuals to a group, is not warranted. If you assume that it automatically holds, that you can always make that type of inference, you commit the fallacy of composition. Now here are some obvious cases where it does not hold. Take the machine again. Suppose it's true that every single one of its parts is very small and weighs very little. So you can say each part has a certain characteristic. It is very light. You cannot from that say, since each part has this characteristic, therefore the machine as a whole will have this characteristic. Because obviously, suppose there's 20,000 parts. When you put together all these very light parts, you'll get a very heavy machine. Obviously, then when you put together the parts, you introduce some new fact deriving from their relationship, which means that the characteristic true of the parts does not necessarily carry over to the whole. Or suppose each part is very inexpensive. It costs less than $5, no matter what part. You cannot say, well, the machine as a whole must be very inexpensive, because if there's 50,000 parts, it can come to $250,000 simply for the machine as a whole. Now the same is true passing from individuals to groups. It may very well be the case that you have a football team, each member of which is the country's outstanding player in the particular position that he plays. It does not follow from the fact that each player individually is the best player in the country in his position, that the team as a team will be the best team in the country. Why? Because when you put the parts together, you may introduce factors deriving from the interrelationships of the individuals that cancel out or outbalance their superiority in their individual positions. You may introduce rivalries, the players may not work well together, etc. A chemical example. Someone says hydrogen is a gas, oxygen is a gas. Water is simply the union of hydrogen and oxygen, therefore it must be a gas. That would be a blatant example of composition. In all these cases, the fact of putting the elements together into a whole or into a group may introduce new characteristics. And if you ignore this and assume automatically that the characteristic is transferable to the whole or the group, you commit composition. Now, a common form of composition revolves around a certain type of equivocation. So you could technically call it an equivocation only because it's an equivocation that forces you to commit composition. It's classified as composition. This is where you have a statement where the verb can be used in two different senses. In one sense, it applies to the subject where each member of the subject is considered as an individual. In another sense, the same verb can apply to the subject where the subject is considered collectively, as a group, as a whole. And if you pass from one to the other, you commit the same fallacy. Let me give you first, without committing a fallacy, simply an example of these two uses. Suppose I make the statement, college students enroll in only 5 courses a semester. And let's assume that's true. We'll ignore the few cases where they take more or less, but on the average, college students enroll in only 5 courses a semester. Now, this is true of each individual college student as an individual. Mr. A takes 5 courses, and Mr. B takes 5 courses, etc. In such a case, the verb enroll in this case is said to apply to the subject distributively. Distributively. It is said to be a distributive statement because the verb distributes itself to each individual. It applies to each individual within the subject as an individual. It means this college student takes 5 and this one, etc. But now suppose I give you a statement like this. College students enroll in hundreds and thousands of courses each semester. That also is a perfectly true statement. But now you obviously do not mean each college student as an individual takes hundreds or thousands of courses a semester. You mean college students regard it as a group. In this case, your proposition is said to treat the subject not distributively, but collectively. Collectively. And you are there referring to college students collectively as a group. Now let me give you one more example just to make this distinction between a distributive and a collective statement. Rodents have 4 feet, or rodents are 4-footed. Now there the are, rodents are 4-footed, is meant distributively. Each rodent, as an individual rodent, has his own 4 little feet. But suppose I say rodents are numerous. Now obviously I do not there mean each rodent as an individual rodent is numerous. It wouldn't mean anything. I'm obviously there speaking about rodents as a class, as a group, rodents collectively. Now if you get the distinction between a distributive and a collective use of your proposition, you can see that you would commit the fallacy of composition if ever you start with a premise which is to be understood distributively, and from that draw a conclusion which is to be understood collectively. If ever you pass, to repeat, from a premise which is distributive, in other words, it applies to each individual as an individual, to a conclusion which is collective, in other words, it applies to the group as a group, then you've committed the fallacy of composition. You've assumed that because something is true of each individual as an individual, it will be true of the group as a group. You will have committed the fallacy of composition. Here is a simple example. This can sometimes be very subtle and very puzzling if you're not aware of this fallacy, that you know something is wrong, you don't know what it is. But here's a fairly clear, simple example. Men are mortal. Whatever is mortal will one day pass out of existence. Therefore, men will one day pass out of existence. Meaning by that conclusion that the species will become extinct. Now that is a fallacious argument. What is the essence of the fallacy? The passage from the distributive to the collective. When you say men are mortal, you're talking about each individual man as an individual. You are saying he will remain alive only so long, and then he as an individual will die. That is true of every single individual. When you come to your conclusion and you say men as a species will pass out of existence, you are no longer talking about individuals. You are now talking about mankind, the species, the group, collectively. You have passed from a premise which treats individuals qua individuals to a conclusion which treats a group qua group. And why doesn't it follow? Obviously, in this case, the conclusion doesn't follow, even if every man does ultimately die, because obviously new ones are born all the time to replace the ones who die. Therefore, you cannot go from the individuals to the group. Or here's perhaps a slightly trickier example. College towns are small towns. Small towns are numerous. Therefore, college towns are numerous. Now you see on the face of it, that sounds like as impeccable an argument as you could get. One thing is another, and the second is the third, therefore the first is the third, but it is an invalid argument, and it commits the fallacy of composition. Because the first premise, college towns are small towns, is that distributive or collective? Obviously, distributive. Each college town, it's said, as a separate individual town, is small. When, however, I go on to my next premise and I say small towns are numerous, is that distributive or collective? Obviously, a predicate like numerous has no application to an individual, and it applies to small towns collectively. Therefore, when I come to my conclusion, college towns are numerous, I'm making a collective statement about college towns as a group on the basis of a premise which gives me information only about each college town as an individual. And therefore I am passing from the distributive to the collective, from the individual to the group unwarrantably, and that is composition. Now, composition, as you see, can be a very subtle fallacy. It's very prevalent. In my experience, for no reason I could clearly explain, I found it most often in two areas, in economics and metaphysics of all places. But I'll give you, before we leave it, one example from each field. I've heard this kind of argument. If the government were to give a subsidy, say $500,000, to this man, that would obviously improve his lot. No doubt about it. That's unquestionably true. The man would be much better off. And the person says, obviously, this would be true of each individual. If I give it to you, a government subsidy of $500,000, that would improve your lot enormously. And to you if I gave it, and to you if I gave it. And I could go through every individual as an individual and say if each one were to receive a subsidy, his lot would be enormously improved. If I then say, well, let's give a subsidy to everyone of $500,000, and then everybody's lot will be improved. It's, after all, true of each individual as an individual, therefore it must be true of the country as a whole. That would be composition. And why doesn't it follow? Obviously because any one individual can benefit from a $500,000 subsidy only at the expense of the rest of the people who are paying for it via higher taxes, inflation, or whatever. But if you were to give the identical subsidy to everyone in the country, then you simply shuffle the money around and nobody benefits except for the bureaucrats who take their cut as it passes through. Here's an example from metaphysics. Everything which exists has a cause. The universe exists, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, do you see that that is composition? Everything which exists has a cause is true if you consider each thing as an individual. You or this wristwatch or this table, whichever it happens to be, any individual thing has a cause. True. And what is it? What makes it possible to say a thing has a cause? Because there are many other things outside of the individual thing which could operate to produce it. When I say the universe, however, I mean not any one individual thing as against others, but the collective totality. Now, obviously, there is nothing other than or outside the universe to operate as its cause. So it would be true of each individual constituent that it has a cause in terms of the operation of other individual constituents. It would not be true of the whole as a whole that the concept of causality is applicable to it. There again is a classic case of composition. Now, before we leave this fallacy, I would like to urge you not to confuse composition with generalization. They are two entirely different phenomena. Let me repeat that statement. Please do not confuse composition with generalization. They are two entirely distinct phenomena. Generalization is a process we have not yet discussed in this course. It comes under induction, and we will get to it in Lecture 9. But as you would probably know just from common usage, in generalization you pass from information about some members of a group to a conclusion about all members of the group. You operate throughout on the level of individual. Your premise tells you such and such individuals within the group have this characteristic, and your conclusion is, well, I generalize, every individual within this group has this characteristic. For instance, this puppy dog wags his tail when he's happy, and this one does, and this one does. And after a few you say, well, I'll generalize, every puppy dog does. Now that has nothing to do with composition at all. The passage is from some individuals as individuals to all individuals as individuals. And that may be valid or not, depending upon whether you take a representative sample and obey the appropriate laws of induction. Composition does not consist of passing from some to all. In composition, you begin. I'll repeat that. In composition, you begin with information about every individual in the group. You start with information about all of them as individuals or as parts. And your fallacy is not therefore generalizing. You already know something about every member of the group, whether it's every member of the team, every part of the machine, or whichever. The fallacy is passing from individuals to the group as a group, which is an entirely different thing from passing from some individuals to all individuals. I hope you keep this in mind. Otherwise, you will decide that all forms of generalizing are fallacious because they commit composition, and in fact they do not. Now, the next fallacy you can regard as simply the companion of composition, going in the opposite direction. In this case, this next one that we're coming to, you start, your premise gives you information about the group as a group, or the whole as a whole, and you conclude that what is true of the group must therefore be true of the individual part, or what is true of the whole must be true of the individuals that make it up. In other words, it's the same fallacy as composition, but you go in the opposite direction. In composition, you start with information about each of the parts or each of the constituents, and you combine them, you see, to make an unwarranted inference about the whole, thus the name composition. You combine. In this one, you start with information about the whole, and you break it up to the erroneous conclusion that it must be true of each part. And the name of this one is division. You see, you divide the whole into its constituents, and you assume that the constituents must have the identical characteristic as the whole. So it's simply the reverse direction from composition. Thus, to take the same examples we used, this football team is the best team in the country. If you say, therefore, each member must be the best, you've committed the same fallacy in the opposite direction, that is division. This machine is very expensive. Therefore, any spare part must cost a fortune. That's division. It's true of the whole as a whole, therefore it must be true of each individual within it, which obviously doesn't follow. Now, when we discussed composition, we said you go from the distributive to the collective. Well, then what do you think division would consist of? Going from the collective to the distributive. For instance, here's this argument. Dogs are common. Japanese spaniels are dogs. Therefore, Japanese spaniels are common. Now, that does not follow. Because my original premise, dogs are common, is a collective premise. It's obviously true of dogs as a group. I cannot from that draw information about each individual subtype within that. It may be the case that dogs are common, but some individual subtypes within them are very rare. If you assume that because it's true of the group collectively, it will be true of each individual subtype, you're passing from the collective to the distributive. You could just as well say dogs are common, Rover is a dog, therefore Rover is common, which would be ridiculous, obviously. Barbers have had centuries of experience. Therefore, mine must be highly skilled. Now that doesn't follow. What's true of barbers as a class collectively does not necessarily apply to each individual barber. Congress exercised enormously bad judgment in voting for such and such a treaty. Therefore, Senator X, a member of Congress, can't be relied on. Doesn't follow. A statement about Congress is a collective statement. Doesn't necessarily mean that each individual within it did this particular thing that the group as a group did. 1 out of every 4 children born in the world is Chinese. Mrs. Jones is expecting her 4th child. Now that is division. Now the only way to keep straight the difference between composition and division is to ask yourself, with what information do you start? Do you start with a collective information and draw a conclusion about individuals? Then it's division. You're dividing your whole, you see. Or do you start with information about the individual and end up with a conclusion about the group? Then it is composition. You are combining your parts. See, composition. Some experience from the exercises will help you with this. And of course, since you don't have to pass an exam, it's not a disaster if you get the two mixed up. But technically, it would be nice to keep them distinct from each other. All right, let us go on to the next one. Very different kind of fallacy, also very common. Fallacy of false alternative. False alternative. Now, a little background before we get to the definition of this one. Central to many processes of reasoning is the need to define what are the alternative possibilities on the question under discussion. How many choices do we have in looking for the answer? And then, after you set out before yourself, well, you have these choices. Let's restrict ourselves to 2. It's either this one or this one. Then you zero in on the side you're in favor of, and you say, this one must be true, and here's my reason. Now, crucial to the validity of this procedure is that you actually specify at the outset all the relevant possibilities. If ever you give an argument, and you say, here are the only alternatives, let's suppose for simplicity you restrict it to 2, but it might be any number. You say, here are the only 2 choices. And you do that when in fact there is another, one or more, other possibilities that you have overlooked. You are said to commit the fallacy of false alternative. It's called false alternative because the alternative you are offering is false. The fact the choice is not between the 2 that you are propounding. There are more other possibilities which you are ignoring. And therefore, your whole reasoning is destroyed at its base. I'll give you a crude example of this. A student does poorly on a test. And the teacher says to him, well, there's 2 possibilities. Either you're lazy or you're stupid. Now, I know you're not stupid, judging from your class comments and so on, so I conclude you must be lazy. Now, maybe in fact, there are no other possibilities, then that's okay. But assume, to make it an example of the fallacy, that the student will come back and say that isn't a fair statement of the possibility. I was sick the night before. The test was terrifically unfair. I was run over by a truck on the way to take it, etc. In other words, there are a variety of other possibilities, and therefore the original statement that there's only these 2 choices, you're lazy or you're stupid, is a false alternative. You would be making him choose between 2 possibilities when in fact there would be others. Now I'd like to stress to you that it is not true that every alternative is a false alternative. There is a strong antagonism on the part of people who are opposed to logic, an antagonism to the very utterance of the words either or. And I want to stress that this fallacy is not opposed to declaring either or. An alternative is false only when it is false. Now you may ask, well, what is the test of a true alternative? The one rock-solid test is, can you show that it's an instance of the law of excluded middle, which we covered the opening night? Can you show that it takes the form, either such and such is or it isn't? Now, if you have reduced your statement of alternatives to that possibility combination of those two, A or non-A, you are guaranteed by the rock-bottom laws of logic that your alternative is true. Either a country is laissez-faire or it isn't. Now, if you said either a country is laissez-faire or it's communist, that is a false alternative. There's many other possibilities. But if you say either it's laissez-faire or it isn't, either a man is a genius at a given time and in respect or he isn't, either you hold logic as an absolute or you don't, either you're alive or you're not, and so on. Those are all perfectly legitimate. There is no fallacy in confronting opponents or in your own thinking with saying in a firm voice it's either or. That is a very, very laudable, logical, and commendable procedure. The only thing that this fallacy calls attention to is you must make sure your either or is justified. And if it isn't, you've committed a false alternative. And the simplest way to show that something is a false alternative if you're confronted with it is point out another possibility. And if you can point out another possibility, if that makes any sense in the connection of the discussion going on, you have established that it was a false alternative. Now, the commonest reason for false alternatives, which are all over the place today, is that people share the same fundamental premise, an unwarranted premise, an invalid premise on some question, a premise which restricts the possibilities that they can even conceive of. And then they simply take two different sides of the same false premise. In such a case, you are confronted with two disputing parties, each insisting that the only alternative to him is the guy who takes the other side of the same wrong premise, and you have a false alternative. That's the commonest explanation for the prevalence of false alternatives. Now I'll give you a historical example. You may or may not know, it doesn't make any difference. At the very beginning of Greek philosophy, there were two philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides. And they both, for reasons which are here irrelevant, agreed that the process of change, of a thing developing or growing or altering in any way, the process of change requires the existence of a contradiction. Now, why they believed that is irrelevant. They had bad arguments for that view, but nevertheless they thought that was true. They both conceded that premise. Parmenides then said, well, contradictions are impossible. We can't have contradictions. And since change implies a contradiction, we'll have to say there is no such thing as change. Change is an illusion, and the world is just a solid, motionless ball without any change at all, and our senses are unreliable. Heraclitus said that's ridiculous. Obviously there's change. And since change requires a contradiction, that shows the universe is riddled with contradiction, and in effect to hell with logic. Now, they bequeathed between them to subsequent philosophy this alternative. Either you accept change and reject logic, or you accept logic and reject change. Now take your choice. That is a crucial false alternative generated by taking two opposite sides of the same mistaken premise. And of course it played havoc with philosophy until the time of Aristotle, who challenged the premise and showed that change does not involve a contradiction, and you do not have to make this choice. Or take another philosophic issue. Most advocates of free will believe that free will means a violation of causality, of cause and effect. They mean by free will uncaused, causeless action, just a bolt from the blue without conceivable explanation. Well, on that premise, you run into the most incredible errors and confusions. For instance, people who advocate that view of free will are immediately vulnerable to the argument, if free will is causeless action, how can you possibly hold a person morally responsible for his so-called free action? Suppose he's walking down the street, minding his own business, and his arm, causeless, without explanation, stabs somebody else in the heart. How can you hold him responsible for this kind of causeless bolt from the blue? So they say if that's what free will is, there's no moral responsibility. On the other hand, they say, if determinism is true, and everything you do is caused by factors outside your control, you can't be held responsible. And since it's either free will or determinism, therefore, in no case can you be held responsible. Therefore, moral responsibility is a myth, and your choice is either your actions are causeless or helpless. There's a good false alternative for you. Free will as a violation of causality, or determinism as your only two possibilities. Now, I trust you know from reading, or if you're interested, you can easily look it up, the objectivist view on this question, which holds that free will, properly understood and defined, is perfectly compatible with causality, and that this alternative I've been presenting is a false one. You can see false alternatives all over the place in politics. I've heard discussions which are barely endurable between liberals and conservatives. For instance, in which one side says, we must give supreme power, they don't say it quite that blatantly, but that's what it amounts to the federal government. And the other side says that is ridiculous. Supreme power belongs to the individual states. We are advocates of states' rights. And they will have a bitter argument about who should be the all-powerful dictator, Washington or 50 subdivisions in the various states. Both agreeing, you see, with the premise that a dictator is required, and it's simply a question, which should it be, the states? And then, of course, you could have the municipalities, and you have a false trichotomy. But all of that is obviously a false alternative, omitting the possibility of individual rights and limited government. Now, I may say one of objectivism's great contributions is to expose the number of false alternatives that were rampant in philosophy across the century. Now, I'm not going to explain all of these or the objectivist view of them. I trust you'd be familiar, but just to rattle off a few to give you an idea of the prevalence of this fallacy. You'll be confronted by many philosophers with this kind of choice. Either you live by reason, in which case you are cold, unfeeling, you can't experience any emotions, etc. You have to be dry, desiccated, dead, etc. Or you experience emotions, in which case you are an irrational, demoniacal, orgiastic, whim-worshipping maniac. That, in essence, is the choice that Plato versus Nietzsche, that Plato and Nietzsche offer, casting a lot, respectively, for either or. Now, I trust you know why this is a false alternative. Either you're moral or you're practical. Either you favor the mind and condemn the body, or vice versa. Either you engage in mindless, promiscuous sex, the materialist view, or you're an idealist and you go by platonic love. In the 30s, it was very common. It was a deliberately propagated false alternative to say there's only two possibilities politically. Either you're a communist or a fascist. And it was a widespread acceptance of the view that anybody who was anti-communist is thereby a fascist. That was a deliberate smear false alternative that was spread and very widespread in the 30s. To jump to another example, the Marxists officially take the view that any state must be an agent of exploitation in the hands of one particular class for the purpose of exploiting another. And then they say either the state will be run by the rich exploiting the poor, which is what they call capitalism, or it will be run by the poor exploiting the former rulers, and that will be the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now there's a false alternative which omits the whole possibility of a state which is simply a neutral enforcer of individual rights and not a representative of class interests. In ethics, this fallacy is obviously all over the place on the question of egoism versus altruism. Either you are selfless and sacrifice yourself to others, and if you say, no, I'm opposed to that, people say, then you must be selfish, in quotes, which they take to mean you run rampant, cutting other people's throats and sacrificing them to yourself. Now there you see the common premise is human existence requires slaughter. It requires throat cutting. Somebody must go. And then the altruist says you should go for them, and the other side says no, you should let them go for you. Now that is a false alternative. And the concept of living by your own independent effort and neither sacrificing yourself nor others is simply not conceived. I've argued with Christians against the proposition you should love thy neighbor as thyself, regardless of his qualifications. And they said, what, you're in favor of hating your neighbor? Obvious false alternative. What about judging each neighbor independently and having no viewpoint about the ones you don't know? Now you see the cause of this is, in a broad sense, a person accepts the bromides of the day as a given. He sees two warring sides. He does not think or question. He simply jumps in and feels, well, he's going to take one side or the other about a war that's already going on. Now the real thing that you have to do is ask before you align yourself with one group or another who are conducting a war, ideologically. Do both sides share a basic premise which is false, so that the alternative they confront is, in fact, a false alternative? In other words, you have to have a critical, independent view, and not merely jump into the fray and take the terms and alternatives as they are already set up. This is a very crucial piece of advice for independent thought, and it's part of the meaning of check your premises. All right, let us take our break at this point. All right, we have a few more fallacies to cover. The next one you can call the appeal to laughter. The appeal to laughter. Now this is very similar to all those argumentum ads that we covered at the beginning last week, but it was defined in comparatively modern times, so it does not have a recognized Latin name. Now in this case, the individual attempts to refute some viewpoint, not by logical analysis, not by consideration of relevant facts, but by turning ridicule against it. He sneers, he laughs, he giggles, he makes a joke. Very often he gets the audience to chuckle and howl and cavort. He refuses to consider the position in question seriously, and he hopes that his attitude will undercut the opponent and cause him to abandon his view without argumentation. So if you had to give an abstract structure to this fallacy, it would be X is false because ha ha ha. Now this is a very widespread phenomenon and fallacy today. Particularly in recent years, publications are riddled with sneers, sarcasm, ridicule, and that whole flip modern manner which they direct against any unpopular position. What they have in common is the attempt to use humor as a destructive weapon, which you can see, I may say, on talk shows as well as in print. A steady stream of guffaws in place of reasoning. This is also common in college classrooms, where an instructor will use his position to answer some innocent question that was sincerely motivated and representing a viewpoint with which he disagrees, not by considering the facts of the matter, but by making a wisecrack, invoking a roar of laughter from the class, and hoping to cow the dissenter into submission. Now, as a matter of fact, it's obvious that anybody who resorts to this is confessing complete intellectual bankruptcy. And therefore the question is, why does this fallacy ever work since it's so blatantly illogical. Why would laughing in somebody's face cause him, as it very often does, to abandon his argument or his objection and give in meekly when it is so blatantly irrelevant? Now, I think the central point in the answer is that laughter is one of the most lethal weapons of all that you can use when it's directed against somebody who is fundamentally insecure, or what we call a social metaphysician. Now, many social metaphysicians do not mind it if their opponents are angry or hostile or hate them. Now, of course, many prefer to be loved, admired, and approved, but still there's a good number that don't care if they're hated. Because if they receive overt manifestations of hostility, they feel, well, I'm still of significance to this other person or persons, even if it's only negative significance. And in such a case, they can survive and even go on maintaining their unpopular viewpoint. But if they are greeted by a wave of laughter, the message that is broadcast to them and that they receive is, we don't even take you seriously. You're nothing. You're a zero. You don't even have the status of a threat. You're simply a laughable freak of no significance whatever. Now that is the message that many social metaphysicians, many people with inferiority complexes, to use that term, simply cannot endure. And in the face of it, they dissolve helplessly. They very often forget their arguments, their points, their facts, and they simply shiver. In a word, I think that laughter in these connections plays on an individual feeling of self-doubt, particularly his desire to be of significance to other people. And then, given this situation, the laughter denies him this significance in a blatant, unmistakable manner. And that's why it is so terrifying to so many, and why it is so widespread today, this appeal to laughter. Now, you could say much more about this, but for a further discussion, I want to refer you to Ayn Rand's article, The Argument from Intimidation, which is reprinted in The Virtue of Selfishness. Because I think that, although that is Miss Rand's title and not a standard logical classification, what she discusses in The Argument from Intimidation, which is original with her, is really the broader principle involved. And the appeal to laughter is simply one subdivision of it, although the appeal to laughter is the way logicians today refer to it. I think, as I say, that the argument from intimidation is really the fundamental fallacy here, and I'll just take a moment to quote Miss Rand on this argument from intimidation, particularly the passage where she distinguishes it from ad hominem. And I'll quote, "This method bears a certain resemblance to the fallacy of ad hominem and comes from the same psychological root but is different in essential meaning. The ad hominem fallacy consists of attempting to refute an argument by impeaching the character of its proponent. Example, candidate X is immoral, therefore his argument is false. But the psychological pressure method, in other words, what she calls the argument from intimidation, consists of threatening to impeach an opponent's character by means of his argument, thus impeaching the argument without debate. Example, only the immoral can fail to see that candidate X's arguments is false. In the first case, candidate X's immorality, real or invented, is offered as proof of the falsehood of his argument. In the second case, the falsehood of his argument is asserted arbitrarily and offered as proof of his immorality." And then just this one summarizing paragraph. The essential characteristic of the argument from intimidation is its appeal to moral self-doubt and its reliance on the fear, guilt, or ignorance of the victim. It is used in the form of an ultimatum, demanding that the victim renounce a given idea without discussion, under threat of being considered morally unworthy. The pattern is always, only those who are evil, dishonest, heartless, insensitive, ignorant, etc., can hold such an idea, unquote. Now, in its specific form of the appeal to laughter, it would be only those who are ridiculous, only those who are laughable can hold this idea. Now, you have the literature available in the Virtue of Selfishness if you want to read up further on this. So I will not say more on the argument from intimidation, but simply observe that I believe the appeal to laughter is simply one concrete within the wider category, and Miss Rand gives many other examples in her article. Now, one last word on this one. The only way to combat it effectively is simply to refuse to be intimidated. You have to say, in effect, after the person has gone through his spiel, now you have cackled and wheezed and grunted and guffawed and chortled. It didn't work. I still maintain my position. Now either present an argument or admit to being intellectually bankrupt. Now, try that. And the whole trick is you have to say it firmly but quietly. And that very often turns off this fallacy right away. But not always. There are people who are impervious to anything. Now, while we're on the subject of objectivist contributions to logical fallacies, I want to mention, without much discussion, one other crucial fallacy defined by Miss Rand, and that is the fallacy of the stolen concept. Now, we've already mentioned that, but just to get it officially and formally in your notes, I'll repeat the definition of it. It is the fallacy of using a concept while ignoring, denying, or contradicting one of the antecedent concepts upon which it itself depends, and without which it could be neither formed nor defined. You don't have to take all that down because you can get it in the literature easily available to you. In essence, you use a concept while denying or evading one of the earlier, more basic concepts on which your concept depends and without which you couldn't have your concept. And we took many examples of it in the opening lecture in this course. An obvious case being, prove that the laws of logic are true. You can't prove it, therefore they're unreliable. The person is using the concept of proof while attacking the laws of logic, when obviously the laws of logic are the preconditions of proof and have to be known and validated first before you can even form such a concept as proof. A grotesque example that I once saw of this fallacy was a little button that somebody was wearing on a subway, and the button simply said, "Reality is a crutch." Now, there is an example of stolen concept if ever I saw it. What is meant by crutch in a context such as that? Obviously, means a way of evading or escaping from reality, such as alcohol or drugs or whichever. Well, it presupposes the concept of reality and of adherence to it, and then by contrast, you take such and such a drug or chemical or whichever in order to escape from reality as a crutch. When you say reality is a crutch, you collapse entirely the meaning of the concept of crutch when it's used this way. And that's a blatant stolen concept. You can think of stolen concept as an epistemological version of biting the hand that feeds you. In other words, destroying the concept, you see, that makes the concept you're using possible. And that's why it's called stolen concept. There's an epistemological thievery. You have no right to use the concept you're using if you deny the concepts that make it possible. You may find it helpful, although it's not perfectly exact, but in essence, to think of the stolen concept as, in a sense, the opposite of begging the question. In begging the question, you use the thing you're trying to prove. Well, in stolen concept, you use, in effect, what you're trying to disprove. You use it indirectly by counting on a concept while simultaneously trying to attack or undercut it. Now, I don't think we have to elaborate this further. I want to spend the time on points that are not available to you in the literature, so just put it on your list for the sake of completeness. All right, next. Cliche thinking. Now, I don't want to insult your intelligence by making a big production of this one, but since it's included on lists of common fallacies typically, I'll just mention it very briefly. A cliche, of course, is a canned proverb, saying, bromide, maxim, aphorism, catchphrase, familiar quotation, etc. And cliche thinking, to put it circularly, is thinking in terms of cliches. Putting it another way, it's not thinking. It's abandoning thought and simply substituting a catch slogan or tossing off some aphorism in its place. Now, this is a fallacy, blatantly and obviously, for any number of reasons, not the least of which is, how do you know which cliche is applicable in a particular case? Very often, cliches come in pairs. And you can establish anything by choosing the right one. You're late to work, you don't feel like hurrying, and you say, haste makes waste. You could just as well say, he who hesitates is lost. You're in love, you want to forget, you decide to leave for Miami, and you say, out of sight, out of mind. What you could just as well say, absence makes the heart grow fonder. You don't feel like doing your homework, you call your friends and you say, many hands make light work. But you could just as well say, too many cooks spoil the broth. You feel like uncritically accepting some business proposal somebody offers, and you say, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. But you could just as well say, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Now, besides this, even if there were no opposite, the whole trick with a cliche, if they've gained wide acceptance, there are usually many situations where they do apply. But the whole trick is, what is the proper application, which requires a process of thought. Now, for instance, you have, let us say, a good job, and somebody offers you a better one, which, however, has some real problems connected with it. The boss is demented, and a few things like that. You might reasonably say a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. In which case, the meaning is, don't engage in foolish risks. But you're in love with some girl or man, respectively, and he jilts you, and you decide to marry the first creep that comes along on the rebound, and you say, well, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. There's a completely different meaning in that application, you see. In effect, give up any ideals or standards and settle for the lowest that comes along. Now, the cliche doesn't tell you. All it says is, if you're counting birds, one in the hand is worth two in the bush. But beyond that, you have to think to figure out what its proper application is. Now, it's obvious also that many cliches are outright falsehoods. Plain and simple. And therefore, invoking them is hopeless. The love of money is the root of all evil. There's two sides to every story. Mine is true for me, and yours is true for you, and, you know, that whole line. The heart is superior to the head. You should love thy neighbor as thyself. Or take even, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. As Shaw pointed out, what would be the application of that to a masochist? And, of course, politically, in our anti-capitalist culture, you just could fight your way through the welter of false cliches. Capitalism is outdated in our complex modern world. Capitalism causes monopolies, depression, cirrhosis of the liver, and you can multiply it as it goes. Now, in a way, cliche, the reliance on cliches, you could argue, is a form of verecundia. Because the normal person who accepts cliches accepts them because everybody says it. He hears it everywhere and he assumes they must know what they're talking about and it's all right to ride on. Now, of course, the fact is it isn't. But because it has a special form, it's usually treated as a separate fallacy. Now, one cliche is so obvious and so widespread that a special fallacy is coined to cover it. So give it, what are we up to, 20 now? All right, call this 20. These are not, graded in order of importance from 1 to 22. There's many optional orders. This one called misuse of the mean. Misuse of the mean. Now, in many situations, there are 3 possible viewpoints, or it seems as though there are 3 possible viewpoints. Over on one side, there is something called an extreme in one direction. Then way over on the other side, there's something called an extreme in the opposite direction. And then, nestling somewhere in the middle, between these, there is what appears to be a mean, a moderate, middle of the road position, which is neither as extreme as the one or as the other. Now, if you argue like this, whatever is in the middle, whatever occupies the mean position, is valid simply because it's the middle, simply because it's the moderate position. You committed the misuse of the mean fallacy. And equally, if you say, such and such a position is invalid because it's extreme, and that's all, not the nature of the extreme, but simply the fact that it's an extreme, you have committed the misuse of the mean fallacy. The misuse of the mean fallacy is the assumption that a mean or a middle-of-the-road viewpoint is valid simply because it's a mean or middle of the road. Now, obviously, the fact that a position is middle or extreme is irrelevant per se to its truth. If you're going to go by logic, you have to have proof, evidence, reasons that pertain to the specific nature of the position that you are arguing for. The fact that it comes between 2 other positions is entirely irrelevant to its truth. Now, there are a number of points to make here. First of all, in most usages, the concept of the mean or the middle is inherently vague. It doesn't tell you anything specific, and all sorts of different, conflicting positions can qualify as a mean. If the mean signifies simply that which is between 2 others, well, depending upon how you select the 2 so-called extremes, you can make virtually anything come out as the mean. Let's take a simple example. The question arises, at what speed should you drive through a school zone? Now, one person might argue like this. Well, a real slowpoke on one extreme would go through a crawl at 5 miles an hour. Now, on the other extreme, you might say it would be the sort of person that goes the normal speed, say 35 miles an hour. Now, I'm going to be sensible and take the moderate middle-of-the-road position, halfway, let us say, between 5 and 35, and I'll go 20. Now, that sounds like it's valid reason. But using the identical method, you could argue like this. On the one extreme, let us say, it's the slowpoke who goes 5 miles an hour. On the other extreme is the speed maniac, with his juiced-up hot rod who goes 125 miles an hour. Now, I want to be moderate. Middle of the road, I'll go only 65 through this school. Now, both of these are appeals to the mean. Now, obviously, depending upon which extreme you select, you're going to have different figures as the mean. The fact that something is a mean as such doesn't tell you anything, except that it's between 2 other viewpoints. To know that a view is rational, you need arguments directed to its inherent nature, not its position on a spectrum. Now, as this last example illustrates, there are many fantastic positions that can qualify as means between extremes. For instance, should we say, on the one hand, there is extreme freedom. You don't want to be extremist. On the other hand, there is extreme slavery. Now, I don't want to be an extremist in that direction either. What I advocate is let's only shoot a few citizens and have only a moderate amount of thought control, etc. Or what about a judge who would say, well, on the one hand, there would be the policy of letting all the innocent men go free and punishing all the guilty men. Now, that would be an extreme of justice. Now, on the other hand, there would be the policy of punishing all the innocent men and letting all the guilty men off. That would be an extreme of injustice. Now, I'm a moderate above all things. I want to be middle of the road, so I'm going to just let a handful of killers off and put a handful of innocent men in prison for life. Now, that would be moderate justice. And obviously, fantastic. What would be the moderate position in regard to marital fidelity? One extreme, presumably, would be to cheat systematically, night after night. The other to be extremely faithful. What would be the moderate position? Well, what? Just have a few adulterous affairs occasionally to keep your hand in the game as a middle of the roader. Now, obviously, if one position is completely false and one extreme is completely true, then the mean is positively irrational and unjustified and disqualified precisely because it's a mean. Now, I regret to say here that one source of the plausibility of this fallacy is the influence of Greek ethics and particularly Aristotle. The Greeks in ethics in general, not just Aristotle, but blatantly Aristotle, committed this fallacy. And they held that the mean is valid in ethics because it's a mean. For instance, Aristotle said, on the one hand, he was discussing the question, what should be your attitude to yourself? And on the one hand, he said, there's the person who has too low an attitude to himself, who walks around saying, I'm rotten, I'm worthless, I'm no good, etc. Now, Aristotle said that's an extreme in one direction, the vice of humility, as he called it. On the other hand, there is, said Aristotle, the extreme in the opposite direction. The person who walks around saying, I'm the greatest thing that ever hit this world, nobody can live up to me, I'm better than everyone, etc. And as he identified it, that is a person who has too high an opinion of himself. And then there's the person in the middle with just the right position, what he called the golden mean. Now, Aristotle did that with a whole host. He arranged attitudes in trinities like that and kept finding the valid position in the mean. I've heard, for instance, now Aristotle himself did not use this one, but I've heard, on the one hand, in connection with the issue of independence, there is the Babbitt, the obvious conformist, who simply accepts whatever society says. Well, that's too little independence. But on the other hand, there is, let us say, the Greenwich Village mentality, the hippie who paints himself purple and has dandelions coming out of his nose, and that's too much independence. That's what I've heard. And then in the middle, there's just the right amount, the golden mean. Now, you can multiply this sort of thing endlessly. And if you don't think about it, it gives a certain plausibility to the idea that there is something good about being the mean. Now, what you will find in these cases is that in almost all, it is not, in fact, a continuum. It is not three different attitudes ranged on a spectrum of the same quality, simply differing in amount. What you will find is that the two so-called extremes are simply two superficially varied manifestations of one attitude, and the so-called mean actually differs in kind, not simply in degree, from the so-called extreme. Now, that would be obvious in the examples I just mentioned. The kind of person who is a braggart and boastful and so on does not obviously have too high an opinion of himself, but too low an opinion of himself when he's seeking reassurance by trying to impress other people. So he has the same basic low opinion as the humble person, simply a different superficial form. And obviously, the Greenwich Village type that I mentioned is just as dependent on society as the Babbitt conformist, only it's a dependence in reverse. He is still completely controlled by the opinions of society, which he finds are what they are and then simply does the opposite. And for instance, if everybody in society started to paint himself purple, he'd stop. And he's therefore not doing what he does because of his own judgment, but simply in reaction to what society does. So it's just a variant of dependence. It's entirely different in kind than the person who judges each question by his own mind independently, regardless of the views of society. Now, what people do, and what the Greeks did also, is, therefore, they make defective classifications. They range what they regard as the same attitude, simply differing in degree, along a continuum, and then they conclude that extremes are irrational. And then, in the name of reason, they urge moderation. Then, now Aristotle didn't go further than that, but then what the moderns who commit this fallacy do is, having used this type of example to suck you into the moderation trap, they proceed to define moderation in such a way that you should compromise on any issue, endorse any contradiction, ignore logic altogether in order to be in the middle. Now there is a blatant case where they use the appearance of reason in order to deny reason. They cash in other words, on a defective classification. Now, in actual fact, extremism, if we're discussing intellectual issues, normally means inexorable, ruthless consistency. And if the person's basic premise is correct, then it is a profound, rational virtue to be an extremist. Now, actually, the deeper reason why there is such an enormous tendency to commit this fallacy, you can't assign it to Aristotle or the Greeks as the real cause of it. That really simply gives people a rationalization. The real reason is fear. That is the type of psychology that hears two sides opposing each other and wants to be friends with everybody. Does not want to be disliked, doesn't want to cause trouble and stick his neck out, and therefore is motivated by the desire to appease, to compromise, to abdicate responsibility, give up thought and judgment, and try and find some way of being able to say, oh, well, to the advocates of A, yes, there's certainly something to A, and I see your point of view. Of course, I'm not an extremist. When he goes to a cocktail party with the advocates of non-A, I also see something to your point of view, too. There's something to be said for both, and my view is a little A and a little non-A. See, not that there is a God or that there isn't a God, but there's sort of a God, and he'll emphasize it one way or the other. Now, this type is worse than the person who takes a firm stand, because he abandons even the responsibility of saying, this is the position I take. And that's what Galt had in mind when he said there's two sides to every question. One is right and one is wrong, but the middle is always evil. Now, I'd like to point out in conclusion not only the illogicality of this fallacy, but its impracticality. If people are conditioned to accept the mean, you can be sure that they will be entirely controlled by extremists. In any clash between the middle and the extremist is going to have to win, and always has won historically by the nature of the situation. Because all he has to do is move his extreme over, extend it. And the person whose primary commitment is let's be in the middle begins to take on the coloration of being too extreme, and he has to move over. Now, there's any number of examples of this, and it is therefore a fact that it is extremists and only extremists who move history. Take, for instance, the beginning of the income tax amendment in this country. Now, there were three parties when that amendment was first being argued. On the one hand, there were those who opposed it completely on principle. That was an extreme in one direction. On the other, there were those who were in favor of it. Now, at that point, I don't have the exact figure, but the worst, most rabid extremists said, well, the government should be able to take 3 or 4% of your income. Now, the great majority of people said, well, that, of course, is rabid extremism. That's socialism. That's communism. 4%. Let us be moderate. Let's say 0.5%, 1%. That's a reasonable compromise. Well, of course, all that happened is the extremists kept upping the ante, and the moderates kept moving over. And today you have a situation where the extremists on one side demand 100%, which is the communists. The extremists on the other side, if you call this extremist, is what is it called? The Liberty Lobby that advocates 25%, who are denounced as rabid right-wing extremists. And the normal liberal is content with somewhere between 40 and 60. Now, you see that you have no hope if you're in the moderate position. Now, I sometimes have nightmares about the following situation. What would happen if the Russians should suddenly declare that they have found a deed entitling them to the Pacific seaboard, Washington, Oregon, and California? Now, I can foresee that on the one hand, there'd be the extreme patriots who say no. On the other hand, there'd be the extreme pacifists who say yes. And on the other hand, and I'm sure particularly in the State Department, as it's presently run, would be those who say, why go to extremes? Give them Washington. Now, of course, by that process, it would not be long before the hundreds of millions of Americans are huddling in Maine. Now, that is not simply a theoretical projection. That is to say, if you look at American foreign policy. Now, the conclusion that I suggest is that you be very careful about anything recommended as moderate, a compromise, the middle of the road, the sensible mean, etc. Judge a position by its merits, not by the fact that it's in the middle. All right, next. Neglected aspect. Neglected aspect. Now, this is a very general fallacy in the nature, to some extent, of a catch-all. In this case, you assert a fact, or you give an argument, which plausibly suggests a certain conclusion. The argument sounds fine on the face of it. But you have omitted, neglected, some fact, some aspect of the case, which, if you brought in, would destroy your conclusion. And thus the name. You have neglected an aspect. You have left out a fact. Now, it can only qualify as this fallacy if there's a certain plausibility to it on its own terms. If it seems to follow, except the person has left something out, then it's called neglected aspect. And of course, what it calls attention to is that before you can accept a conclusion, you have to integrate all of the relevant evidence, not simply some selected portion of the evidence, which might lead to a conclusion that could be easily overthrown by looking at some other aspect of the case. And it's because of the recognition of this fallacy that when you swear an oath legally, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the whole truth means you have to bring in every relevant fact, because a partial truth can be misleading. And that's why it's called neglected aspect. Now, a crude example, which I don't know anybody who would ever commit, but just to illustrate it, would be a doctor who would argue as follows. This patient has a disease caused by such and such a virus. This liquid will kill the virus. Therefore, let's give it to him. Now, it sounds plausible on the face of it until you bring in, let us say, the fact that it will also kill the patient. Neglected aspect. This is a very, very common fallacy in connection with figures and statistics of all kinds. You know, the saying that there's three kinds of liars: liars, damn liars, and statisticians. People come, for instance, and say, do you know that you have 5 billion germs in your mouth? Well, on the face of it, that sounds frightening. You wonder what monstrous disease that represents until you find out that those, I don't even know that that's the correct number, but that some huge quantity of them is perfectly normal, and it has all kinds of functions. I don't know what digestive food, and without them the tongue would fall out, or whatever it is. Somebody tells you that there's a foreign country implacably hostile to the United States whose population has just risen 50% in the last year. Which sounds impressive until you find out that it's this man and his wife on an island and they gave birth to a child. There's 3 million people unemployed. Now, from that you can draw no conclusions, although it might plausibly sound that it's disastrous. But, for instance, it makes a big difference. Is it Monaco or the United States? Who is included in that figure? Young babies, terminal cancer patients? There's many, many facts you'd have to get before you knew how to interpret that. Now, in certain cases, an individual deliberately withholds the evidence that opposes his conclusion and presents only the facts favorable to the conclusion he wants to come to. In such a case, neglected aspect is given a special subname, which you don't have to know, but it's not a special fallacy, just a form of neglected aspect. It's called special pleading, and sometimes it's called slanting. That is, what you say is true, but you deliberately withhold relevant facts and just push the facts that will lead to the conclusion you want. Debaters are very often guilty of this. They take the side of the issue that they want and push that. Politicians are notorious in committing this fallacy. They tell all the virtues of their party and all the things it has or allegedly has accomplished, and no reference to all the disasters it's brought about. Or all the marvelous services it will provide, and no reference to the cost, the taxes, the inflation that it will be brought about. That's all special pleading. Newspapers are hotbeds of this very often, not only in their editorials, but in their factual news. There were cases during, for instance, the Vietnam War about the morality of which I do not want to enter here, but regardless of whether you're for it or against it, there were cases where you could tell a newspaper's editorial position simply by the facts that it presented in regard to that war. You see, all the news, every time the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese made an advance, and nothing whatever if the American or South Vietnamese side made an advance. Whenever some atrocity was visited on the North, pictures and sob stories and so on. Whenever the atrocities were committed by the North on the South, no mention of who started the war, etc. Now, there is just simply a deliberate blank out of all the facts they didn't like. Now, I don't mean to suggest I'm in favor of the war, but as I presented it, if a newspaper did this, that would be neglected aspect. Special pleading. Here's an example. How can you say that capitalism has produced the highest standard of living in the world? What about the slums in Chicago or in Harlem? What about the migrant workers in Appalachia? What about unemployment, etc.? Now, what facts have been omitted or neglected? Well, two blatant ones. First, that we don't have full capitalism, but simply a mixed economy, which is part capitalist and part non. But secondly, and more directly relevant here, the so-called poverty in this country is the most incredible riches compared to the standard of living in the rest of the world. And this is simply ignored, neglected, in the case of a person who puts this forth, this kind of argument forth. Now, a neglected aspect is enormously common in economics. The interventionist schemes that are offered by the governments today, Republican or Democrat, consist of taking some problem out of context, prescribing a remedy which seems to meet it, ignoring altogether its long-run consequences, focusing simply on one out-of-context element, what you think will be the immediate result. That's neglected aspect. Price control, for instance. Milk costs too much money. We have to make it available to the poor, a bureaucrat will argue. Therefore, let's reduce the price simply by fiat. Now, of course, all he sees is then milk will be cheaper and the poor will be able to get it. He doesn't take into account such factors that the marginal milk producers can no longer make a profit, leave the field, thereby reduce the supply, make milk more scarce. They go out of business and that causes unemployment, etc. And the poor end up with less chance of milk than they had before. But none of that is taken into account. Now, in his book, Economics in One Lesson, Henry Hazlitt discusses a number of these interventionist measures. And although he doesn't use the word neglected aspect, he has a paragraph which amounts to saying that the essence of what's wrong with them economically, all these measures, is that they commit the fallacy. So I'll read just that one brief paragraph. Quote, the bad economist sees only what immediately strikes the eye. The good economist also looks beyond. The bad economist sees only the direct consequences of a proposed course. The good economist looks also at the longer and indirect consequences. The bad economist sees only what the effect of a given policy has been or will be on one particular group. The good economist inquires also what the effect of the policy will be on all groups. Unquote. Well, in other words, the good economist, like the good anything, doesn't commit neglected aspects. Now, a final exhortation. Do not use the word neglected aspect loosely, because otherwise you will find there is only one common fallacy, and that is neglected aspect. Because every fallacy is a neglected aspect in this sense. If you commit verecundia, you're neglecting the fact that other people aren't infallible authorities. If you commit the appeal to laughter, you're neglecting the fact that a ridicule doesn't violate a position, doesn't refute a position. Now, if you use it that way, obviously it becomes empty, and there's only one fallacy. So, by convention, we agree. We will not call it neglected aspect unless there's nothing else to put it under. It's neglected aspect only if you can't find anything else for it to be. And now the last one we're going to look at. Also a very general fallacy. This one you use only in desperation, but there's nothing else to say at all. And this is simply called irrelevant conclusion. Irrelevant conclusion. Now, in this fallacy, you don't commit any of the others. There's no emotional appeals, no begging the question, no equivocation, etc. You may even prove your point conclusively, convincingly. There's only one thing wrong. The point is irrelevant to what you're supposed to be proving. You start out on one issue and you're proving something that is beside the point. Now, very often this is simply called the fallacy of non sequitur, which is Latin for, it doesn't follow, non sequitur. It's beside the point. Now here's a blatant example. Segregation must prevail, for it can be proved scientifically that human beings differ in all sorts of ways. Well, as soon as you hear that, you say, on the face of it, that has no plausibility of any kind. What's the relevance? Human beings differ. Well, so what? How does it follow from that there should be segregation? There's no attempt to make a connection. You would simply say, irrelevant conclusion. Doesn't follow. Sometimes, if the attempt is deliberate to change the subject, it's called diverting the issue. Changing the subject. But that's not too fancy a term. It won't get you very far at cocktail parties, so you could still call it a relevant conclusion. For instance, you've heard this type of argument. Religion is a good thing. Why? Well, man needs to be certain of something. Well, suppose he goes into a long spiel about why man has to be certain of something, and he really does prove it. It's a complete non sequitur. It's complete irrelevant to say, therefore, religion is good, because the question is, why religion? Of all the possible things you could be certain of. Or, government housing is desirable. And then the person, to prove it, goes into a speech about why decent housing is important, etc., which would be entirely incontestable, except it doesn't prove that the government should provide. Now, there's a certain trick here in distinguishing between neglected aspect and irrelevant conclusion. They're both very general. And the only real distinction you can draw is this. In the case of neglected aspect, the argument has a certain plausibility on its own terms until you bring in the facts that the person is leaving out. There's a certain plausibility. It seems to follow, and then you think, aha, he left out this fact. In the case of irrelevant conclusion, it doesn't even on its own terms have any plausibility. It's simply irrelevant. It's a non sequitur on the face of it without knowing anything else. Now, it's often hard to distinguish because what seems plausible to one person will seem insane to somebody else. And therefore, there are certain options here. But the example I gave at the beginning of last week, if somebody says all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, there's no particular fact you can say he's overlooking. He's just simply out altogether. And so you say irrelevant conclusion, if you bother to say anything. Now here's a couple of examples. Some educators claim that co-education leads to distractions which interfere with the student's work in class. But reliable tests show that there is very little difference in mental ability between boys and girls. Well, so what is the immediate question? What's it got to do with it? Oh, I've heard this one, for instance, all the time. You say to somebody, your viewpoint is false. Wrong. And he says, what do you mean? I have a right to my opinion. It's a free country. Now that is a blatant change of subject. The question was not, do you have a political right to assert your opinion? Certainly. The question was, is your opinion correct? And that is a blatant case of irrelevant conclusion. Now, one common form of irrelevant conclusion is sometimes given a special name. It is called extension. S-I-O-N. Extension. Extension you can think of as an irrelevant refutation. It gets its name because in the normal case what happens is an individual puts forth a viewpoint which somebody wants to refute. But instead of refuting his viewpoint, the opponent extends or exaggerates the viewpoint into something the person did not say, and then proceeds with all pomp and circumstance to demolish the exaggeration and to conclude he has demolished the original viewpoint. And that is a form of the straw man technique. You know, you set up a straw man, and then it's easy to blow it over. But that doesn't prove anything about the original position. It's irrelevant. You say, I'm against any alteration in the principles of the American Constitution. The person says, you can't be against everything new. Well, and he might make a long speech about progress and the importance of change, etc., none of which you denied. You made a specific proposition. He is refuting an extended or exaggerated version of it, and it's irrelevant. You say, technology has immeasurably improved man's life. And he comes back with, it hasn't made everybody wealthy overnight. Look at all these, etc. Well, that's beside the point. You never claimed it had. Now, I want to distinguish this irrelevant refutation, this extension, which is a form of irrelevant conclusion, from a perfectly valid technique of reasoning. There is such a thing as reductio ad absurdum, which is not a fallacy. Reductio is just like reduction without the N. Ad, A-D, which means to. And absurdum, which is absurd with U-M on it. That's a valid technique of refuting something, which means simply reducing it to the absurd. And the pattern is, if you accept such and such, then you're forced to accept such and such. But this consequence is absurd. Therefore, the original position which led to it is false. That is perfectly valid, and it is not extension. It is not irrelevant conclusion. If the consequence that you claim was implicit in the original position really was implicit in it. If that consequence really does follow, then you can refute a position by showing that it leads to absurd consequences. So, for instance, I can't here raise the whole issue of socialized medicine, but suppose a person were to argue like this. Medicare is wrong because it leads to socialized medicine, or it embodies the principles of socialized medicine. And socialized medicine is bad. Therefore, Medicare is bad. Now, that as such is perfectly valid, if he can show that, in fact, Medicare does involve the principle of socialized medicine and would ultimately lead to it. That would not be extension. Extension is committed if you claim that a position leads to certain consequences which you refute, when in fact it doesn't lead to those consequences, and therefore you are refuting something which is not logically implied in the original. Now again, in connection with irrelevant conclusion, as with neglected aspect, I must stress this is a miscellaneous catch-all. Every fallacy could be called irrelevant conclusion. From the fact that people believe it, veracundiam, it's irrelevant. Doesn't follow. But it's true. From the fact that a mean man said it, ad hominem, it doesn't follow that it's false. So if you're going to use irrelevant conclusion in the broad sense, there's only one fallacy. Irrelevant conclusion. Only. If we're going to make this special miscellaneous fallacy, we again by convention say it is the last thing you call something. If you can squeeze any other fallacy out of it, you give it some other name. You call it irrelevant conclusion only when there is, in essence, nothing to say about it except it's simply irrelevant. It's beside the point. It doesn't follow. All right. We have now concluded 22 common fallacies. There are others, but these, I think, are the most significant ones for our purposes. Let us then take a pause for a few moments and turn to the home. Thank you. Before we start, I forgot to give you homework for this week. All the rest of those fallacies that were not assigned last week, you are now capable of doing. And then I won't bother rattling off the numbers, but every one between 1 and 61 on pages 1 through 5 under informal fallacies that was not assigned for this week, you can do for next week. All right. Do I have a volunteer for number 1? Does anybody have an idea what number 1 is? Yes. Now I'll have to repeat what you say so people can hear.
Yes. I believe that the
argumentum ad ignorantium. I agree with you entirely. Do you want to indicate briefly why?
There's no reason to suspect that I'm basically evil. It's not just because X is true because you can't disprove it. That's it.
Yes, you say that the essence of the fallacy is he's saying something is true, or in this case he's actually saying something is possible, because you can't prove that it isn't so. So he's saying you committed certain irrationalities, certain evasions, certain corruptions, or at least it's possible that you did. Prove that you didn't. You can't, therefore it's possible you did. That's a classic ignorantium applied to possibility. And of course the relevant application of the proper principle here is a man is innocent till proven guilty, which is simply the application of ignorantium to a legal or moral question. I may say that this particular one is very widespread, number 1, and it's really one of the basic causes of self-doubt among people who have that problem, who have self-doubt not because of particular things that they can name, but simply a generalized, how do I know I'm not no good if I knew everything about myself? It's a very common attitude, and it is a classic case of ignorantium. Do I have any questions or comments on this? Yeah, wave, because I don't necessarily see that well. Yes?
Are you justified in feeling fear if you get constantly
beaten up all the time, or lose contest all the time? Should you justifiably have self-doubt?
You're asking me a question which is much broader than the nature of ignorantium, but you want to know, suppose you lose contests all the time, are you justified in feeling self-doubt? No, certainly not. It depends what kind of contests and why you lose them. And even so, supposing you're doing your best entering a certain type of contest and you fail, self-doubt in the sense I mean is a fundamental metaphysical judgment on yourself to the effect that you are no good. Now, there's nothing that can possibly warrant such a judgment if you are, in fact, doing your best and are intellectually honest. There's no standard of performance you can arbitrarily set for yourself and say, I must be able to speak French better than my competitor, or make more money than my rival, or finish my book faster than somebody else, etc. Otherwise, I'm no good, because you're setting arbitrary standards for yourself. There's much more that could be said on that, but I'll go on to, I think, number 3. Long hair is superior to short hair, as proved by the consensus of distinguished youth leaders. And how do you know who it is? Well, they all have long hair. Yes? Petitio principii, you say, by arbitrary definition. Yes, I certainly agree with that. Why? What is he trying to redefine in this case? Distinguished youth leader, right. And he's simply arbitrarily redefining youth leader as anybody who's in favor of long hair. So he accomplishes nothing. Did anybody say verecundiam for this? You did. Well, I would not accept verecundiam as a valid answer. For this reason. If the fallacy simply stopped as follows: long hair is superior, as proved by the consensus of distinguished youth leaders, period. Then it's a blatant appeal to authority. But presumably in this case, the person is going on to try to justify the particular authority he's citing. He's trying to say the authority has credentials and should be listened to, not simply blindly accepted. But his fallacy is that in validating their credentials, he begs the question and assumes the point at issue. Therefore, I don't think it would be correct to say that this is technically an example of verecundiam, as it's worded here. The lady on the aisle in the green, I think. I think that much is correct. Even if he hadn't begged the question on an issue of whether long hair or short hair is superior, is not something of a technical kind that it would be appropriate to appeal to experts or specialists for to begin with. And consequently, you could say in that respect that without even the circularity, the petitio involved, it's fallacious on the grounds of appeal to authority, if you look at it from that point of view. Yes? Does circular reasoning enclose within it arbitrary definition? That depends on how you use the term circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is sometimes used as synonymous with any petitio, in which case, obviously, it would be, this would be a form of it. But as I used it, circular reasoning is one specific type which does not involve arbitrary redefinition, but starting with the proposition, then going to another one or more, and then ending up with your original, in which case this would not be that particular form. Let us go to number 6. Number 4. Number 4. Your arguments against Red China's system of government are completely worthless because you haven't even been there. I'll try to be fair and go to different sides, but if you're near the back, if you wave, I can see motion. Yes. Argumentum ad hominem abusive. I agree. Why? He is attacking the person, not his statement. But you think of a case where this would not be fallacious, if one thing was changed about it. Is there any circumstance in which the fact that you hadn't been to a country might be relevant? Well, for instance, suppose you were citing some fact which could only be an eyewitness fact. The kind of colored tie a particular person wore, assuming they wore them in red china. And you had no first-hand evidence and no testimony. And you simply said, this guy wears a red tie. It would be valid to say you haven't been there, how could you know? But I deliberately formulated this, your arguments against the system of government, which do not depend, you see, upon eyewitness facts, but depend only on philosophic considerations about the nature of man and what must be the consequences of certain types of government. In this connection, it is completely abusive ad hominem to tell a person you haven't been there, because whether he has been or not is irrelevant if he can construct an argument showing that from the nature of the system, it has to work a certain way. Yes?
Complex too, because it assumes you have to dig in and argue about different government.
Is it a complex question because it assumes you have to be there in order to know anything about the system of government? I wouldn't call that complex question because complex question has to be in the form of a question. It has to be something ending with a question mark. You can say they make an unwarranted assumption, which is what mediates the ad hominem. And the unwarranted assumption is that only eyewitness testimony is relevant. There's no such thing as a philosophic argument against the system of government. But we don't have a special fallacy of simply unwarranted assumption. So if you want, you can say that that is a fallacious element involved, but the direct fallacy here is attacking the person by means of declaring that he hasn't been there. Let's go on to 6. I understand that there could be many questions on each one, but we simply want them as illustrations, and at a certain point they exhaust their interest and value. So let's turn to, I think, 6 was next. Yes? Ad populum, yes. Argumentum ad populum, and you say because of the use of emotive terms. This, by the way, was very hard to make up, because you have to write something that is devoid of content, that consists simply of emotional demagogic terms, which I found very difficult to do, but then you come up with things like diabolical conspiracy, power-lusting vultures, slimy tentacles, blood-drenched claws. None of it says anything. It's a blatant demagogic appeal. Anything on that one? All right, number 7. This is the argument of the so-called psychological hedonist. Everybody's out for his own pleasure. That's the only kind of thing there is. And then you give a counter case, and let's say that's his way of achieving pleasure. A very common actual argument that people use. Yes? You say it's petitio. I certainly agree that it's petitio. Circular reasoning in what form? What is the circle here?
Well, he starts off saying maximum personal pleasure and resulting motivation. He ends up with the exact same thing.
Well, he ends up, it's certainly true with the exact beginning. He simply restates it. But I think it would be preferable in this case to take a somewhat different form of petitio. Did somebody have a different version of petitio? Unless you use circular reasoning broadly to mean any form, I think there's a somewhat different version of petitio, more obvious in this one. Yes? Arbitrary definition is what I intended. What is the arbitrary definition here? In other words, the person is defining pleasure, or the pursuit of pleasure, in such a way that anything the person does qualifies as the pursuit of pleasure. So at the beginning, you think that by pleasure he means a specific emotional experience distinguished from many other possible motivations. Then he redefines pleasure so that anything a person does qualifies as his personal pleasure. And you ask him, how do you defend that definition? Well, he then restates his thesis. So I think the best answer would be petitio via arbitrary redefinition. Anything on that one? Yes.
Now, you said that to redefine the term in the second part of the sentence. You didn't give the definition of redefine it at all. The difference.
Oh, let me clarify that point. When you say that a person redefines it, it does not imply that he had to, at the beginning, give a definition and then officially give another one. He may give no definitions at all. You simply determine from the usage that his original statement counted upon or assumed one meaning, and in the course of the argument, he has switched that meaning. It doesn't require that he formally give an official definition. All right, let us look at number 9. Now, number 9, I think you can make a case that it has 3 different fallacies in it. It's following each other consecutively, so it's a glorious one from a famous philosopher, Benedetto Croce. Who sees any fallacy anywhere in this? I'm trying to get different people, I think. Over on my right at the back there. You say veracundiam, argumentum ad veracundiam. And what part do you refer to there? Whole peoples invoked and defended it as an obvious quantitative version of veracundiam, the appeal to authority. Who sees another fallacy in this? Yes. Circumstantial ad hominem. Yes. Where?
The fact that the adversary is applying on their own account is simply because they were engaging in.
Exactly right. The fact that the adversaries applied it on their own account means they themselves were inconsistent. They claim to be opposed to it, and here they themselves do it, so it must be okay. They're engaged in a contradiction, so we can ignore their argument. And that is the classic case of circumstantial ad hominem. And did anybody see anything else? You can make a case for still one more fallacy. And when you get 3 in a row like that, you have a gem. Trying to get somebody that I haven't had before. Yes.
So there seems to be a qualitative veracundium theory in reference to lofty soul.
You say a qualitative veracundium because you're saying men of the loftiest soul founded and created it. Therefore, isn't that implicitly an appeal to authority? Qualitatively. I guess you could make a case for that. I was thinking of a different interpretation of that very clause. It would be a different fallacy.
But the idea is that they're sort of moral experts.
That they're moral experts. Yes, you could make a case for a qualitative veracundium on that phrase. I was thinking of something different. Does anybody get something different specifically from the phrase, men of the loftiest souls founded and created it impartially? Now remember, the question at issue is the Inquisition good or not? Is it justified? And his argument is, lofty men founded it impartially. Well, what could you accuse him of doing? You could accuse him of engaging in begging the question, of a petidio, of a question-begging epithet. Because until you know that it's justified, how do you establish that it was lofty men who did it impartially, as against demented or evil or monstrous people who did it for bad reasons? So you could make a case that this one contains veracundiam, circumstantial ad hominem, question-begging epithet. In other words, it's a mess. All right, number 13. Smith will give you a number of arguments why you should vote for the Democrats, but don't fall for them because he's been hired and he himself votes Republican. Who got what for that? Yes. Well, you say it's ad hominem, abusive, and circumstantial. How is it circumstantial? In other words, it's circumstantial because he himself votes Republican, and therefore you're simply attacking him on the grounds of personal inconsistency. Correct. How is it abusive? You said it was also abusive ad hominem. You say the fact that he has been hired by the Democrats implies that his integrity or veracity is for sale, and that he's therefore not a decent person who's sincerely motivated. You could interpret it that way. I hadn't intended that when I wrote it, but you could take it as a combination of both. I had only had in mind circumstantial ad hominem, but if you interpret it, you see, in real life, these things occur in long, drawn-out discussions. And therefore, the trouble with interpreting them when they're just a couple of lines of type is to know what the surrounding context is. But if the surrounding context amounted to this, don't listen to what he said. He's a lobbyist. He's in the pay of such and such a party. He's a hired ideologue who will spew anything. That would be plain abusive. As against, he himself contradicts what he says, which would make it circumstantial. Anything else on that one? All right, number 14. Obviously, hard work is undesirable because we've just taken a poll. At the very back, yes. Argumentum ad verecundiam, correct. Why? Right. Quantitative, it's an appeal to great numbers, the great majority. An obvious example. Yes? You say it's begging the question because it is redefining undesirable as definitely disliked. I can't say I see that. I don't see that there's any implication that undesirable actually means people dislike it. If the person said that, it would be so blatantly false, the definition, that I don't think it would have any plausibility. It seems to me that he means by undesirable simply no good, immoral, or rather an evil, a bad, something that's not good. And then he goes on to try to give an argument for it, which amounts to what people's opinion is. So I can't say I see a redefinition there. Conceivably, if we were inventive enough, we could make a context where that would be implied, but I don't see it here. Yes?
But isn't this a kind of Mill Bentham thing, that which is undesirable is undesirable?
Is this the kind of Mill Bentham thing which says that which is undesired is undesirable? No, not in this case exactly. The sort of thing you're referring to is a classic example of equivocation. For those of you who don't know the reference, John Stuart Mill argued like this. He wanted to prove that pleasure is the only good thing, the only desirable thing. And he argued like this. The only proof that something is audible is that people actually hear it. The only proof that something is visible is that people actually see it. Well, he said, the only proof that something is desirable must then be that people actually desire it. Now, people actually desire pleasure, therefore pleasure is desirable. Now, in that case, it's obviously what fallacy? Well, I don't know that it's obvious, but in that case, it's the fallacy of equivocation. And in that case, it's equivocation on part of a word, on able, ibble, on the suffix, because audible means is capable of being heard. Visible means is capable of being seen. Now, that type of fact you can establish by the fact that somebody does see it or does hear it. But desirable does not mean the ibble. Doesn't mean is capable of being desired. It means ought to be desired, should be desired. It's right to desire it. And there, of course, it's completely irrelevant that people actually do desire it. Now, in this sense, Mill was appealing to people's actual desires to establish what is desirable, which was verecundiam, but he did it and made it plausible via an equivocation on a suffix, which is not involved in this example. Let us look at number 15. Number 15. Yes, at the front.
I don't see anything wrong with that.
You don't see anything wrong with 15? Neither do I. I've deliberately put number 15 down as valid, and I'll warn you that there's one more on this set of exercises that is valid. which I put in simply so you wouldn't automatically assume that everything involved a fallacy. Now, in this case, the essence of it is supposed to be he has certain credentials. He has a law degree, experience, etc. And the person carefully delimits the conclusion he comes to. He says, well, I guess he should know what he's talking about. The chances are that his advice is correct. Well, we could quibble about the qualifications and about the validity of Harvard, but without arguing about that, assuming that it simply is an example of establishing credentials of an expert in a technical field and carefully delimiting the conclusion you're entitled to come to, I would say it's no fallacy. We have to, unfortunately, put on a little speed if we're to finish. Let me myself take 16, which I think is a clear case of baculum, argumentum ad baculum. He's trying to establish that conscription is wrong, and his argument is you'll be drafted if you argue against it, which is blatantly a threat, not an argument. 18. What do I have for 18? Everybody wants love, no matter what they say, because man's need for love is universal. You say petitio. I agree. What type of petitio? Restatement. In the sense that we're using circular reasoning, I wouldn't call this circular, unless, as I say, you're going to use circular reasoning as simply synonymous with any petitio, because there's no circle here, there's no steps. All the person says is, all men want love. My proof is, it's universal. Well, universal is another way of saying everybody wants it, and consequently, it is a restatement. Let's jump to, I think, 24 was next. How can you possibly argue against socialized medicine? Everybody in every civilized country has it, the facts are clear, etc. Which is that? Yes? Verecundiam, simply a quantitative version. Yes?
Can it be verecundiam 2 times over in that institution of quote-unquote history?
Well, can it be verecundiam 2 times over? The countries today and the trend of history meaning the countries in the past, yes. But once you say it's once, he's appealing to a mass. You don't add too much if you say the ones present and also the ones past. Sorry, I'm putting on a little speed just so we'll be sure and get through these. What about number 25? I'm completely unprejudiced. Go ahead and tell me your vicious argument. And I'll decide whether it's valid or not. Yes? Petitio, it's a question-begging epithet. And which is the question-begging epithet? Which one word? Vicious, right. You can't call an argument vicious before you know whether or not it is valid. Notice how fair I was. I made the objector, the fallacy committer here an opponent of modern art. I couldn't do that too often, but sometimes I tried to mix the pace so that the conclusions would not necessarily tally with the objectivist viewpoint. Number 26, very common form of argument. You have to raise this, assign this legislation. It's a good law. Look what's going to happen to the vote if you don't. What is that? Yes. Ad baculum. It is a threat. Right. Have anything else for that? All right. Number 29. Now that's a trickier one. 29. You asked me to give you a valid argument to prove the truth of the law of contradiction. He proceeds to give one. Whatever is presupposed by all knowledge must be true. The law of contradiction is presupposed by all knowledge. Therefore, I infer that the law of contradiction must be true. That's a trickier one. Who got somebody that hasn't asked before? Yes. Well, give me first the wider term. It's a petitio. Yes, it's definitely a petitio, but you say it's a restatement. I don't see that it's a restatement. How is it a restatement does not involve an argument. It doesn't involve premises and a conclusion. A restatement would simply be, for instance, The law of contradiction is true because that law is not false. That would be a restatement. But here he goes through a whole panoply. He's got premises and a conclusion, so he does more than simply restate it. It is a petitio, but it's not a restatement. It's not an arbitrary definition. It's not circular reasoning. It's not a question-begging epithet. It's a miscellaneous petitio. What is the petitio? Where does a petitio would mean he's trying to prove the law of contradiction. Would mean that he somewhere has to rely upon the law of contradiction. Only where does he rely upon it in this case? Yes. In the fact of arguing as such. Why does his conclusion follow from his premise? Remember, we said in any case of reasoning, the conclusion follows from the premises only if you appeal to the law of contradiction. Whenever you reason, you say, such and such a premise is true, such and such is true. Therefore, since the law of contradiction is true, the following conclusion must follow. Well, if the conclusion is the law of contradiction, then the structure of your reasoning is, such and such is true, such and such is true. Now, since the law of contradiction is true, therefore the law of contradiction is true. In this case, you are assuming the point at issue, not as one of your formal premises or redefinition or anything like that, but by the sheer act of reasoning, you are appealing to the law of contradiction in order to justify your inference. So that's a tricky petitio, and I designed it simply to illustrate that, in fact, any attempt to prove the laws of logic would commit a petitio. It wouldn't make any difference how impregnable the premises were. In the act of reasoning, you must have the laws of logic, and therefore they precede the province of proof. 33. Of course, this is an important story. The New York Times gave it 6 columns on the front page. This is perhaps the standard argument used by television journalists to determine whether something is an important story, to see what the New York Times or the Washington Post did with it. In which case it's what? Fallacy. Yes? Verecundiam, right. The New York Times treated as a religious authority, and if you know something about the front page of the New York Times, you know what considerations go into those 6-column spreads, and they are not necessarily objective news value. 34. The most standard version of this particular one. Philosophers have tried to prove the existence of a supernatural dimension, obviously God. They haven't proved it, but you haven't disproved it. Maybe, therefore, they're right. That's the argument for religious agnosticism. And that is clearly what? It's a bat. Ignorantium, right. In the version of possibility. You can't disprove it, therefore it's false. 35. Bill is marvelous. Now I'm assuming here that this means because I always enjoy myself in his company. So that second sentence is the argument for the first. If it's simply a casual observation, then there's no fallacy. And the other person says, I disagree, and by implication, because it depresses me just to be in the same room with them. Now what fallacy is that? Yes. Appeal to one's own emotion. The fact that you enjoy yourself in his company doesn't prove he is marvelous, which is an objective value estimate. You might be perverted. And on the other hand, the same is true if it depresses a person to be in somebody's company. It doesn't prove he is no good. All right, number 37 from the Communist Manifesto, which I won't bother reading. At the very back, the lady on the aisle. You say it's prestige jargon. Well, I wouldn't say that. The word bourgeois is, you might say, emotionally loaded, but I don't think that in the context of the Communist Manifesto, this is particularly fancy language. I don't think he's trying to awe the people into submission by using polysyllabic terminology. The essence of what he's saying in this one is, you're a bourgeois, you come from such and such economic circumstances, therefore I can ignore your argument, which is more obviously, what fallacy? Yes. Ad hominem, abusive, right. 40. You argue that happiness is possible. Well, you're wrong. Wait till you've lived. You haven't lived. Therefore, your argument is unsound. The lady, yes. Abusive ad hominem, right. If he's given an argument, it doesn't make any difference if he's 2 days old. If it's an argument, it has to be judged on its own terms. 43, of course it's a great movie. I loved it. And assuming again that I loved it is the reason. In the very corner, yes. Appeal to one's own emotion. That's the same as Bill is great. Right. 44 we don't have time to discuss tonight. Remember, we'll have to do 44 next week, but it's more complex. 45. Let me just polish off a few of these in the few minutes that we have remaining. 45 is abusive ad hominem, attacking Aristotle's logic simply on the grounds that time has passed, the time when Aristotle lived. That's a personal attack, abusive ad hominem. 46 is petitio, and there is a classic example of circular reasoning. He goes in an actual circle, and here I pride myself on having made up an anti-capitalist argument, that is to say, it's a fallacy of someone arguing for capitalism, but he goes in a real circle. Capitalism is good because it leads to individual freedom, which leads to enhanced production, which leads to capitalism. Now there's a classic case of a real circle. So that would be circular reasoning. 49, a common form of argumentum ad misericordiam. You have to raise my grade. Why? Not because of objective considerations, but because I have 2 sick children, I'll lose my job, etc. Obvious appeal to pity. 57, he claims he remembers his former life. He was the Pharaoh of Egypt. You can't prove that he wasn't. Well, that is clearly argumentum ad ignorantiam. The person fails to remember, the onus of proof is on he who asserts the positive. Where are we now? 58. What's the reason for filling out these forms? You'll be fired if you don't. That is baculum. Argumentum ad baculum, a threat rather than an argument. And finally, 60. 60 is an indirect form of verecundia. Argumentum ad verecundia. It says societies disagree profoundly, and therefore we can never know the objective truth. Well, what is the implicit premise? We could only know the truth by consulting society, but it doesn't give us an answer. Therefore, we can't know. What is the fallacy of saying the only way to know the truth is to consult society? Appeal to authority, verecundia. So this is implicitly rests on verecundia. And it's a very common one. All right, next week do the rest of them, and we'll take up them plus the one that we didn't get to tonight. Thank you.